Hold back, boys, hold back. All right, this will be the second half of what we started in what we just went through in the first lesson. So this will be false sending events, and it's starting in Acts 17 rather than in I think it was Acts 13 was where we started, or before there. Anyway, we're going to look at Acts 17, several sections of verses here, and different things that go on. Let's start with verse 16 about synagogue Jews first. Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. So there were people that met with Paul. Paul's meetings involved them that met with him. Let's go on, 18. Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him, and some said, "What is this? What will this babbler say?" Others, some, "He seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods," because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is?" Verse 20. And, for thou bringest strange things to our ears. We would know therefore what these things mean. For all the Athenians and strangers and all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, "You men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you're too superstitious. You men of Athens, I perceive..." Whoops, that was a repeat. Verse 23. "For as I passed by, I beheld your devotions. I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore you ignorantly worship, I declare unto you." Who is God? He goes on to describe God in verses 24 to 29. "God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands," as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth life to all, and giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed. So there's it's another phrase of the many Bible references to dispensings, times, ages, ministrations. There are various, a lot more than what I've thought of offhand there, but it says, "and the bounds of their habitation." That could refer to separation of the continents, or the introduction of languages, or boundaries of the land. Verse 27, this is in Acts 17, "that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us." We saw in verse 17 that they were right near the synagogue. though he be not far from every one of us. Acts 17:28, for in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, Adam was created by God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device. And let's go to verse 30. And the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. So he's still emphasizing the gospel of God there. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, we will hear thee again on this matter. So Paul departed from among them, howbeit certain men clave unto him and believed, among the which was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So again, we see there were others that met with Paul. The Dionysius and Damaris, and those don't sound like Jewish names, do they? It's still before the temple vision, when Paul was told that in the future he would be sent to all men. But Paul is at liberty to preach to whoever he wants to, Gentiles, Greeks, alien Gentiles. It's a matter of, what Christ said to him was a sending, not a restriction. Let's look at Acts 18 in Corinth, from verses 4 to 19. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. So here in 18, we're still with the Jews and the Greeks that were first. And when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit, and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, your blood be on your own heads. I'm clean. From henceforth I will go unto the Gentiles. Go to what Gentiles? Paul was saying that he would go to the Gentiles in the context. Remember, there were the Jews and the Greeks. The Greeks would be the Gentiles that he was talking about, that he could see there. Acts 18:7. And he departed thence, and entered a certain man's house named Justus, one that worshipped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. And Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his house. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed, and were baptized. Then Paul, again, this is before the temple vision, when Paul received information that he is sent not to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Verse 9, then spake the Lord to Paul in a night vision, in the night by a vision, be not afraid, but speak, and hold not thy peace. Christ did not give Paul all the information in Acts 9. Here we see Christ revealing to Paul that he has much people in this city. Verse 10, for I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. Verse 11, and he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. And when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul, and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, This fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, If it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O you Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it, for I will be no judge of such matters. And he drave them from the judgment seat. And all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Gallio cared for none of these things. Gallio cared for none of those things. Well, we notice back in verse 8, Crispus was the chief ruler of the synagogue, and that he became a believer. Sosthenes had become the chief ruler of the synagogue, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1, Sosthenes had become a believer, and he co-writes Paul's epistle to the Corinthians. The apostate Jews kept losing their leaders to the gospel of God and then to the gospel of Christ. Acts 18:18 and 19. And Paul after this tarried there a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. 19, verse 19. And he came to Ephesus, and left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue, and reasoned with the Jews. That was at Ephesus. Well, that's the last of the ones that I've noted, the false sendings or false impression of a sending, misunderstanding of sendings. I just want to draw these things together here now before we close for the night. As the scriptures have shown here, none of the reasons are true that some people believe that Christ sent Paul to all people immediately upon salvation in Acts 9 verse 6. Paul was originally separated from his mother religion to the gospel of God, and then in Acts 13 verse 4, Christ sent Paul to the work. Verse 2, 13:2, the work, in a dispensation of the gospel, to the Jew first and also to the Greek during Israel's diminishing. And then in Acts 20 verse 6, according to Philippians 4:15, Christ extended that sending to all men. We're talking about Acts 20 verse 6. It would be in the dispensation of the grace of God that we're in now. And he had said that he would do that back in Acts 22. Paul reported it, the temple vision. Actually, it happened in Acts 18:22, but to the best we can tell, Acts 22 verses 18 to 21 or 17 to 21 is the report of that temple vision that happened earlier. And as you read Paul's presence in Acts, you can see a definite change in the emphasis at around Acts 20. Before Acts 20, Luke emphasizes Paul's visits to individual synagogues. After Acts 20, Paul emphasizes changes in the situation and the doctrines that were to accommodate Israel's few that would still come to faith. Look at, we're going to read the temple vision and what happens shortly after Paul reports about that he was sent to all people, even to the Jew cursers. Acts 22:17, and it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and saw him saying unto me, Make haste, get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. And I said, Lord, they know that I've imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believe on thee. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. And he said unto me, Depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. And they gave audience unto this word, and then lifted up their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it's not fit that he should live. And they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust in the air. Those same Jews that permitted the Greeks, the devout Gentiles, to worship in their synagogues, worship their God, Israel's God, in their synagogues, they were incensed when Paul would suggest that God sent him to preach salvation to the alien Gentiles that were a curse to Israel. After all, God had covenanted to curse them that curse Israel, and yet Paul was saying that God would save those alien Gentiles that cursed Israel, if they believed the gospel of the grace of God, that Christ died for their sins, was buried, and rose again. So, and just one more thing, you can see a distinct change, like we mentioned in Acts 20, but that correlates with an actual change in the tone and some of the statements in Romans chapter 15, and a third place that you can see that change in parallel is 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Go through all three chapters and you can see the changes and how they confirm each other. I'm done. So let's see, what any questions or comments? That finished the entire series.